The goal is to reduce the warming of the Earth before the catastrophe comes.
Some observers believe experimental additives are turning these long lines of exhaust into chemical contrails. They call them chemtrails. They say it's all part of secret atmospheric tests, and humans are the unknowing guinea pigs. Are some contrails more than normal fuel emissions and frozen water vapor? We call on witnesses from both sides. Contrails have existed for as long as aircraft have flown. They normally occur when hot engine exhaust meets humid and frigid air at high altitudes.
So a jet plane flies through this cold atmosphere. It produces a hot exhaust that is mostly composed of carbon dioxide and water vapor.
This exhaust condenses into visible ice crystals. They form white streaks which can linger for minutes or hours. Aviation experts claim with increased air travel we're seeing more contrails. There's nothing more to it. But some people believe that the same aircraft can release experimental chemical additives in the air as chemical contrails or chemtrails. In this way, government agencies can either manipulate the weather or counteract global warming. But some people claim chemtrails are harming an unsuspecting public. Eyewitnesses and researchers who believe in chemtrails say that jet contrails don't vanish within minutes as they once did. They now linger and spread, sometimes for hours, forming strange, suspicious patterns. Rosalind Peterson is one of those believers.
It's not normal for us. It's a grand experiment.
Peterson lives in Northern California near San Francisco. At one time, she worked for the State Department of Agriculture. Part of her job involved being aware of environmental issues.
I first started noticing unusual contrails in 2002 when it was brought to my attention by a friend of mine. He took me outside of his office and we began to look at these persistent jet contrails.
Peterson thought she saw a connection between aircraft activity and reports of chemically contaminated water in communities throughout California.
There were unusual high spikes in chemicals and heavy metals. Barium, aluminum, manganese, magnesium, zinc. And I suspect that we're getting the pollution from something in the atmosphere that's being released.
Peterson became so alarmed about the chemical contrails that she formed an organization called California Skywatch, a group dedicated to clean air.
I started documenting what I was seeing. I took pictures on my breaks. I took pictures at lunch hour. I started to really get angry because our once deep blue skies were no longer deep blue. They would turn into a white haze, and they would turn into these man-made clouds blocking the sunlight.
Peterson discovered that she wasn't alone in her concerns. Hundreds of websites revealed that persistent airplane contrails had become a worldwide problem.
I started then to research internet sites and government agencies, the EPA, NOAA, NASA, the United States Air Force. I learned that there was a lot of atmospheric heating and testing programs going on. I learned that there was lots of equipment that would leave these type of persistent plumes and spray chemicals.
Will Thomas is an investigative journalist who believes that some contrails are part of secret atmospheric experiments. He's been writing about them for over 10 years.
This is a deliberate project to slow down global warming. These trails were appearing over rural areas, away from navigational beacons and normal air routes. They would appear for weeks at a time and then disappear entirely, only to reappear months later, unlike normal scheduled air traffic.
Thomas believes chemical contrails are an indication that someone is using jet emissions to engineer the weather and slow climate change.
The problem with chemtrails is that when we attempt to geoengineer and interfere with complex, interrelated atmospheric processes, we are in for unintended consequences on a major scale.
Geo-engineering is the artificial manipulation of Earth's environment on a large scale. In the early 1990s, American nuclear physicist Edward Teller was among the first scientists to model an experiment that would address the issue of global warming. He speculated that aluminum oxide could be injected into the upper atmosphere. It would act like tiny mirrors and deflect a portion of the sun's rays back into space. Supposedly, it was never put into practice. But activists believe the government has revived Teller's theory with some dire health consequences.
Some of the literal fallout from this chemtrail project are these 10-micron particulates falling by the megaton on unsuspecting people, plants, and wildlife. Now, a human hair is 100 microns across. 10 microns is submicroscopic. It can impact our lungs, it can inflame our hearts, give us heart disease, leading to fatalities. So this material comes down randomly in invisible clumps.
Dave Dickey also believes in chemtrails. As a landscape contractor for a large city, he spends a lot of time out of doors.
Contrail development is different than it ever has been in the past. And I do remember one in January of about 2002, where the number of flights overhead were extremely unusual. The number of contrails in the sky was unbelievable. We were counting 40 to 60 flights. And out of those 40 to 60 flights, most of them left an incredibly persistent large plume which would spread out and cover the sky.
As a landscaper, Dickey has to be familiar with the types of trace chemicals usually found in the environment. He regularly takes water and soil samples and has them tested.
There was some research done that claimed that aluminum oxide could be used to reduce global warming. And I thought that if there was any chance that aluminum oxide would be used in the atmosphere, that it would show up in precipitation.
He collected rain samples on days when he noticed heavier than usual air traffic and took them to a lab.
And I expected to see baseline measurements where aluminum would show up in precipitation at about 0.0093 milligrams per liter. Very small amount of aluminum naturally present in precipitation. It was 20 times higher approximately than what was expected to find.
Dave Dickey believes that what he captured was the fallout from chemically laden contrails.
I was really hoping that we'd find natural water samples. And when I did find aluminum and barium, it's just another one of the indicating factors that something was unusual.
Theoretically, scientists can cool the Earth using chemical compounds placed in the upper atmosphere. But could other substances be put there for more ominous purposes? Military victory or defeat can depend on the weather. A commander who can control the weather has a weapon as powerful as any air force. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. military began seeding clouds along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to create floods and wash out North Vietnamese supply routes. It was known as Operation Popeye, and crews flew over 2,000 spray missions.
I was told initially by a friend, he said his brother was in the military service. He said when there is these heavy spray days, when there's lots of persistent contrails to keep his family inside, when they were outside exposed, to have them go in and take showers. And he couldn't talk about it. He couldn't explain more than that.
We have extensive studies that the civilian aircraft, the airliners, were laying plumes that basically dissipated within seconds to 2 minutes. The military aircraft in the same airspace laid plumes lasting 4 to 8 hours. The weather conditions are the same. The plumes are entirely different. One is civil and one is military. Something is going on.
Dave Dickey also believes the U.S. military is behind a lot of the chemtrail activity. He claims to have seen 2 very suspicious contrails while touring a civilian airport.
It was actually the day we spotted 2 aircraft, 2 KC-135s, and it was call sign Petro 011 and Petro 012. The air traffic controllers were kind of showing us how the tower worked, and they identified these 2 aircraft as 2 American military KC-135s. And what we could see was a contrail. We couldn't see the aircraft. It was just amazing to watch the grid patterns that the KC-135s were leaving.
People who research chemtrails are convinced there's a conspiracy underway to change the weather. A growing number of people believe that seemingly normal contrails are in fact experimental chemtrails. As such, these compound-laden artificial clouds drift and linger in the sky. Chemtrail believers think it happens for several reasons.
This is a deliberate project to slow down catastrophic global warming.
I think that some of the programs have to do with military operations.
Dr. Wayne Evans is an atmospheric scientist. He uses remote sensing devices, such as satellites and a spectrometer, to study greenhouse gases and the contents and behavior of contrails. He first noticed contrails because they formed at the same high altitudes as cirrus clouds.
And you see the two contrails forming amongst the natural cirrus cloud that's moving in. So the contrails are forming cirrus cloud and there's natural cirrus cloud in the same area. Well, most natural clouds actually reflect more sunlight back to space than they supply infrared heat energy towards the Earth. However, cirrus clouds are different. They actually radiate more heat energy than they reflect solar energy back to space. And therefore, cirrus clouds contribute to global warming.
Cirrus clouds drift in the same upper atmosphere as contrails. When the humidity and temperature are just right, contrails can themselves become cirrus clouds and have the same warming effect on the climate. Patrick Minnis has specialized in cloud research for 25 years at NASA Langley Research Center.
We had found that contrails were producing much more cloud cover than we ever thought they did. This one particular aircraft produced a contrail that was covered an area of 4,000 square kilometers and lingered for 6 hours. But we also found that there were contrails covering much larger areas and lasting more than 20 hours.
If contrails are so pervasive and efficient at spreading over large areas of the sky, could scientists use them in experiments that could benefit the environment?
You could view contrails as a form of inadvertent weather modification.
Deliberate weather modification is an attempt by atmospheric scientists to nudge Mother Nature in the right direction. Using aircraft with spray mechanisms to dispense chemical compounds into the sky, weather can be suppressed or intensified over a limited area for a period of time. Project Storm Fury experimented with a process known as cloud seeding. Aircraft would fly into the eye of hurricanes and spray silver iodide. In theory, the chemical compound would bond with the supercooled moisture in the hurricane and cause it to freeze. A number of complex changes to the eye wall were supposed to take place and weaken the hurricane's destructive speed and power. Eventually, the project failed as costs escalated into the millions of dollars without demonstrating conclusive results. But as technologies advanced, cloud seeding was put to other uses.
In the last 10 years, there have been major advances in the type of silver iodide that we're using.
Terry Krause is a meteorologist and project manager for North Dakota-based Weather Modification Incorporated. The company owns a large fleet of aircraft and conducts cloud seeding projects in more than a dozen countries around the world.
The demands for fresh water are increasing. People think nothing of drilling wells and extracting groundwater. Well, now we're trying to use modern technology to extract water that goes unused in this river of water vapor that is passing over us each second of the day. A lot of people don't realize that California has been conducting wintertime cloud seeding for almost 50 years to supply the increasing demand for water in California.
If chemicals like silver iodide dispensed from aircrafts can make it snow in California and rain on the wheat fields of Indiana, what's to stop atmospheric scientists from engineering the climate on a global scale? Geo-engineers look at ways to alter climate systems by introducing chemicals into the upper atmosphere. Scientists recognize that one of the most efficient and economical ways to do this is with the use of high-flying aircrafts.
We're certainly not going to do anything that might endanger the climate system. Geo-engineering has been around for a number of decades, but because the climate system seems to be changing more rapidly than we expected, then we're resurrecting the idea and considering it more seriously.
Tom Wigley is at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He has published theories about geoengineering as a strategy to combat global warming.
The particular type of geoengineering that I've considered in some detail is putting sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. If there's a big explosive volcanic eruption like the eruption in 1991 of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, sulfur dioxide is injected into the stratosphere, aerosols form, and there is a measurable and fairly well understood cooling effect.
The sulfur dioxide from volcanoes has a beneficial effect on climate. It can reflect solar rays, cool the Earth's atmosphere, and offset global warming. Scientists like Tom Wigley see a lesson in this.
We could fly airplanes in the upper atmosphere, in the stratosphere, and have big tanks of sulfur dioxide that we injected into the stratosphere as the planes flew around.
There's been an explosion in commercial air traffic over the last decade.
There are regions in the United States where there are so many jets, where the jet traffic is so high that in fact you can get substantial amounts of contrail clouds that blend together. This is something very, very different.
Some people believe that contrails can be transformed into chemtrails when jet fuel is combined with chemical additives. They claim that airborne experiments to control the weather and slow down or reverse global warming have begun. They say that the sheer number and persistence of contrails in the sky is visible proof.
I designed this poster as a jet contrail index to show the different types of contrails that people are seeing in the skies. And these different types of persistent contrails, I have questions about. Why these formations? Why different dispersion rates? Why do we have X's? Why do we have long parallels with wisps coming up, these persisting parallels? We have knots on a rope. What's actually going on? We have skies that show one type at the same time as another type, and we get vibrant spectrums, for example, that look like this.
Whether clouds or contrails, their contribution to climate change is an acknowledged fact. But chemtrail believers go a step further.
Well, jet fuel emissions lead particulates. The EPA and health officials all tell us that particulates are a pollutant and that they exacerbate asthma and other things.
Those who believe in chemtrails keep a close eye on the health of those who live under these overhead activities.
In incidences where doctors and nurses reported very high levels of emergency room admissions, 2 and 3 times above normal in 122 cities, they said it's not the flu. They said we do not know what this is. Correspondents in those cities contacted me and reported, in their words, heavy chemtrail activity. We can go further and say that air traffic controllers in the United States have privately expressed their concern to us, the investigators, of public health problems because of this particulate matter falling down, which could very possibly be bringing down viruses, fungi, and bacteria that live and breed in the upper atmosphere.
Some industrial practices pollute the planet and cause global warming. But chemtrail believers also say that the evidence of higher than normal levels of aluminum and other metals in the atmosphere is a direct result of airborne experiments with climate change. The theory behind geoengineering is that scientists could put substances into the upper atmosphere that would reflect sunlight back into space, lowering surface temperatures to combat global warming. But has this concept already gone beyond theory?
These ideas have been around for a long time, and they range everything from firing artillery shells full of soil into the stratosphere to using synthetic chemicals like aluminum oxide, which, if the particles were small enough, they might float around in the atmosphere for a number of years and reflect sunlight. And finally, using gases such as sulfur dioxide which reflects sunlight. So in effect, what you would achieve is putting millions of tiny mirrors in the atmosphere that would reflect sunlight.
The government of the United States and other governments are not going to admit to the chemtrail project. They would have to admit the dire gravity of the situation we are in. Now we are far down the road. It becomes harder and harder to admit that, in fact, this has been going on for years. Looking up from ground level, we can observe chemtrails that are much different from the normal condensation trail.
The visual evidence is mounting, and with it, the chemtrail believers' concerns have grown. What the scientists at Kettering University tested was commercial jet fuel. The United States Air Force did not grant Best Evidence's request for a sample of the high-performance fuel they use in military jet aircraft. And that, according to those who believe in chemical contrails, raises another concern.
The United States Air Force releases tons of aluminum-coated fiberglass called chaff over California and other states.
Chaff isn't an aluminum fuel additive. It's ejected from the underbelly of a military aircraft to confuse radar and avoid detection by enemy surveillance.
They're like little needles coated with aluminum, and they're bundled together, and they have been used since the Second World War to produce artificial targets for radar.
Chaff drifting in the air can also help scientists track wind currents.
When it's released from an aircraft, these needles are so small and so lightweight they follow the air motion. So it's a very clever way of getting wind measurements in clear air.
Chaff technology can therefore be used in tracking weather modification experiments.
The Department of Defense just a year or two ago sponsored a workshop in Washington, D.C. on weather modification. So it makes you wonder if, in fact, the military is still continuing to address weather modification in their, in their toolkit. And that's fine. I have no problem with that.
Whether anyone can be proven innocent or guilty, there's little doubt that the technology and the potential for chemical contrail experimentation does exist.
I've contacted the U.S. Air Force, and they said, we are not doing that. It's not true. This is the same body that has come out with a report owning the weather in 2025, calling for weather force specialists, flying tankers, to lay reflective particles in an operation they call aerial obscuration.
We need to take advantage of everybody on this planet to help solve the problem of global warming. If we can do it with some form of climate engineering, all the better.
According to chemtrail believers like Rosalind Peterson, Dave Dickey, and Will Thomas, the evidence seems irrefutable. They're convinced that chemicals are being placed in the atmosphere using jet aircraft and their contrails. These activities, they say, are reckless attempts at climate change, and they are being kept a secret.
In the winter of 2005, the United States government established a Federal Bureau of Weather Modification in Washington, D.C. This is a government-mandated agency whose stated mission is to modify the weather and climate. Under this rubric, I believe they could come out and admit to a chemtrail-type project.
The case we call chemical contrails may never be solved without full government disclosure. And yet neither side in the debate denies that contrails are a problem. Contrails are a natural consequence of jet travel. They spread and linger and become part of the cloud cover over the Earth. Scientists acknowledge that in this way they contribute to global warming.
We don't have 100 years, we have maybe 20 years before we start seeing some of the serious effects of climate change.
Eyewitness accounts, backed up by satellite images, prove just how widely contrails are blanketing the planet.
I would not be surprised to see in the next year or two, as public clamor increases for something to be done to mitigate the worst effects of climate change, that the U.S. government could come out and admit to this program.
If we're not going to be able to come up with replacement technologies in time, we're not going to be able to regulate emissions in time, we're really left with taking these other extraordinary means. The goal is to reduce the warming of the Earth before the catastrophe comes.